Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this lunchtime lecture. My name is Jason Chan, a member of Faculty of Architecture, University of Manitoba. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homelands of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Our speakers today join us from Nairobi, which is exciting. I'm so excited about this encounter. Kabaji Karanja and Stella Mutegi, founders of K Bureau, just to highlight their works, have been part of recently 17th International Architecture Exhibition, Venice Biennale. Well, it's coming. There's supposed to be scheduled last year, but the pandemic pushed to this year. Who knows what's going to happen this year, but it's exciting to see their work there. The Around the World Summit, organized by Guggenheim Museum 2021, just happened a month ago. Cooper Hewitt designed Trinity 2019, 2020, London Festival of Architecture 2018. Kabaji is an architect and spelunker is a word I had to look up. Is a cave explorer. Is a member of REBA, and he studied at Loughborough University, Brighton, Westminster, and Kingston University. Stella is an architect and spelunker, sorry, cave explorer, which the word I had to look up, but anyway. Studied at University of Newcastle in Australia, and worked at various offices in Kenya before founding Office K Bureau together with Kabaji. With that introduction, there's a full bio on the website as well. With that introduction, I would like to welcome Kabaji and Stella. Here we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay. Maybe to begin, to express our sincere gratitude for inviting us. We appreciate this invitation from the prestigious University of Manitoba. And yes, it's probably our first lecture, online lecture that we're giving to that side of the world. So it's exciting for us as well. So thank you for the opportunity. As introduced, thank you. My name is Kabage Karanja, architect, and we run Cave Bureau alongside Stella. I'll just allow her to just introduce herself as well, and then we can kick off. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Greetings from Nairobi, Kenya. It's about 8 p.m. right now, so excited and good to be here with you who are still in daytime. Yeah, and looking forward to a good engaging time with you.
Great. So I wanted to start off with this slide, and it's obviously the introductory page to the lecture. But we deeply acknowledge your statement and your traditional territories acknowledgement, which we find quite inspirational, and we just wanted to take time to appreciate that as a recognition of the founding fathers and mothers of the territory within which you reside. We deal with a lot of local communities and really our ancestral lands, and so this is quite a good testament to begin the lecture. So the subject matter of this lecture is titled The Anthropocene Museum. It's a project that we've presented on a number of occasions as highlighted. It will be a subject project which we'll present hopefully in the Venice Biennale that should be coming up in May, where we have an installation we're building there. Equally in the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, where we exhibited some of our models and leather drawings as part of the exhibition. So we will be touching on that project, which has been a project that's gestated for quite a number of years, and we look forward to run you through it. So if you allow me, I'll just read a short extract to introduce the lecture. It is not too difficult to contemplate that our first experiences of architecture and its production in our minds was of an architecture that always existed since the birth of the earth 4.5 billion years ago. And indeed, the universe that stretches even further back in time, where vast masses of hot gas and matter rammed through space and time, pulled through in by gravitational forces, framing spaces and cavities, and indeed caves that eventually settle over millennia. It was through the movement of rocky masses around the endless number of suns, where tectonic shifts within planets of rock melting lava flows afforded the formation of spaces of shelter, such as on Earth, for living things to thrive. Our furthest distant hominin relations that go back almost 8 million years ago, such as the Sahelanthropus, right up to our very own 250,000 own Homo sapien species, experienced this heritage of cave inhabitation in its rawest formation. Civilization's oral and recorded histories, from religious revelations within caves, philosophical metaphors and narratives about emergence from caves, to the embedding of our cultural thoughts and values across the cave walls, have actually formed an intrinsic part of our past, present, and soon to be future.
We'll begin this lecture with me just reading out what you can see on your screens. Cave as geological structures and spaces are ingrained in our prehistoric consciousness. For thousands and indeed millions of years, they have influenced the way we perceive and define the world around us. Humanity's early experience of inside and out, the nave, light wells, shafts and chambers and echoes, among many other architectural experiences and features, can be directly connected to our ancestors' encounter with caves and associated networks across the ages.
So as part of our exploration and studies and return back to the caves, we don't go alone. We go with many thinkers, many philosophers, artists that have come before us to really try to unpack a lot of the challenges we feel we face in Africa and I think around the world, to look at a sort of post-colonial world and a post-colonial existence. And Frantz Fanon is a deep inspiration for us and a guide through our journey in that direction. We naturally also take an Orientalist cloak with us to look at the world and analyze the challenges we face. The heritage, obviously, from Foucault, Michel Foucault, and Martin Heidegger, of course. And we tend to have a sort of conglomerate of literary histories that we take along on different paths in our journey through the caves. And this group, in a way, look, for example, at the middle of the screen and this slide. You have a book that was titled Kenya, A Country in the Making, between 1880 to 1940 by Nigel Pavitt. And very much looking at the literature at that time and a sort of critique on how it was very much a sort of colonial representation of looking at a land and almost stating that without the European perspective on the ground, the country wasn't made. It needed to go through a making process. And so we tried to delve into a lot of scriptures, texts speeches, utterances within our colonial heritage to unpick the baggage, unpick the crimes, and pick the sort of challenges of our time, which in many respects are represented and are layered on cities, layered in the rural landscapes. And it's something that needs deep thought.
This is a photo that we took earlier this year in January. It's a photo taken inside the Shimoni slave caves. They are located in a place called Kwale County. Kwale County is off the Indian Ocean coast of Kenya. And these caves are run by the National Museums of Kenya. And as nice as this photograph looks, a few years ago, actually not a few years, it's a few centuries ago, it was a place of terror for many men, women, children who are held captive as slaves here. These caves were used as holding caves. They got people from the interior lands of Kenya. They were brought to these caves, sorry, and they were chained here as they awaited ships that came along the coast and picking up slaves along the way on their way to Zanzibar. Zanzibar is an island off Tanzania, and Zanzibar was the main slave market of East Africa. Yeah, you can see in this second photo is them now in the ship after they've been loaded onto the ship on their way to be sold in Zanzibar.
We also go into other caves, and this cave is called the Mbai Cave Network, and located not far from the capital city, a cave that was actually used as a space of congress and a space to contemplate the future African state. And I say that because it was the home for the anti-colonial fighters known as the Mau Mau, and also a number of communities that composed and created the Mau Mau. And they fundamentally chose caves to find refuge and to stage resistance and stage their battles against the colonial powers and contemplate and conceptualize, at least we imagine, what it was like to think of a future African state without colonial, should I say, oppression. It's a really intimate cave. It's believed to connect right down to the Suzuka Mountain. The evidences of that, the fact that it's actually a volcanic cave, a lava tube to be precise. As the volcano erupted, it spewed lava through the ground and it sort of emerged out and has a river right at the top. And as you can see, a waterfall that pours in. But evidences on the roof of the cave within this nave are darkening and blackening caused by fires that were lit, obviously, by the Mau Maus, and these have been dated, even if it was not so long ago. And also early man tools were discovered within this cave. And so the heritage of these spaces are quite fundamental. And we look in caves in general as spaces of heritage architecturally, and spaces of resistance that actually allowed us to form the states that we are in and the nations effectively. We collaborate with artists and have a number of forums and discussions with artists, and one of them is called Osmond Macharia, who's some of his works featured in the Black Panther movie and some of the works from that. And this piece specifically touches on the Mau Mau freedom fighters. what we know in our history books is there were both male and female and children, female fighters who were part of the struggle. And he creates this sort of really interesting imaginary depiction of the freedom fighters here, where he creates an almost fantastical hair and lock system, because naturally the Mau Maus would let their hair grow into a full dreadlock. A warrior sort of a main view, and they gained such huge reputation that Malcolm X himself and Martin Luther King spoke about the Mau Mau. So their heritage and their sort of work reverberated across the world in the middle of the 20th century. And so culturally, it's an important a symbol as well as a reference point architecturally for us when we think of the Mau Mau. We also look quite deeply into other networks. As I mentioned, Suzuka Mount, and this is a cave that also housed, if you'd call it, the Mau Mau freedom fighters. And it's quite a large network. This is very close to the mountain, still a volcanic lava tube cave. But some of the chambers we found actually would say architecturally definitely appear as though, you know, they're sort of referenced from ancient architectural works around the world. And this, the Pantheon on the right, as you can see, but obviously the cave predating the Pantheon by a few millennia or so. What's interesting with this cave is that it's regarded and called the baboon parliament. And it's a space where baboons refuge in the evenings away from leopards. And these baboons are quite unique. They are quite afraid of humans compared to the urban baboons, who are a bit more brave to be around humans and sort of exploit the food that we waste. They are very timid, but they can be quite dangerous if startled. But also beyond this cave are bat chambers, and a sort of specific species of bat, the giant mastiff bat, that is unique to this location, especially in the numbers that roost within this cave. So we argue here that, you know, we have our own architectural heritages, which match, if not surpass, those of the great north, the global north, if you'd call it. Because very often it is argued that architecture really, except you'd argue from the pyramids, we don't have too much heritage, and the huts, and if you call it. So we look at caves with equal gravity. Yeah.
And as much as we focus a lot on caves, we also have a normal office, which focuses as a traditional architectural firm. But unlike other traditional firms, we also spend a lot of time on research. This is us. We are young, we are eclectic, we have fun, we keep doing different photo shoots. So if you follow us on Instagram or on our website, you'll see us, you know, with different props and different poses for next time. But we want to make a cultural and indigenous impact on architecture here where we are in Kenya and indeed in Africa at large. So both Kabage and I have worked in larger architectural firms. And because of that, we are very particular about remaining a small bureau. We don't want to grow too big, but yeah, we still want a big portfolio, but with fewer people. But as we had mentioned earlier, Kabage and I are both foreign trained. Kabage in the UK, myself in Australia. And what we do at CAVE is we look at the city, and then we have dissected the city into three different portions, if I could call it that, or areas, three main areas. The first area we call the origin, the second area we call the Maid, and the third area we call the void. Now I'm going to start with the origin, which is the image you see on your screen right now. And for our generation, without divulging how old Kabagi and myself are, but our parents were born during the colonial era. So these are people who are currently in their 60s, mid 60s to late 80s. So these are people who are born in the 30s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. So they were born when Kenya was under colonial rule. Now, Kenya gained her independence from the British in 1963. And so this, our generation, our parents' generation, was the first graduates in our universities. They were the first civil servants. They were the first doctors, first lawyers, and so on and so forth. Now, they didn't live in the cities. They more or less lived in sort of what you see on your screen right now. But they were the first people, once they started getting education, they were the first people that then did the first rural to urban migration. So they came into the cities like Nairobi, and as I mentioned earlier, were the first professionals. But from the origin, the colonial city, due to the segregation of the settlers, the colonial masters, if I would call them that, and the indigenous habitats, was further subdivided. And the next slide you see is what we call the void. So the origin was then divided into was put into the colonial city, and the colonial city further divided into the void and the Maid. Now, the void is where a large majority of the city dwellers live. Most of the workers within the city come from the void, and the void is a very problematic area. It's usually classified using terms such as low income, informal settlements, slum dwelling, and neglected neighborhoods. Now, ideally, this dysfunctional space stems from how it was originally created in the first place. And it was created from oppression by colonial government. So the colonial government chose the best areas of the city, and then they settled there, and then the rest of the people, the indigenous people, were put in areas such as this, in places that were deemed lesser or inappropriate for a white colonial person. So even then, even during the colonial struggle, location was still a thing. And it's unfortunate that even today in 2021, these spaces are still very much fundamentally entrenched in our thinking. I mean, this is 58 years after independence. We still carry the same mentality that was put in us by the colonialists, that this is a lesser place to live. It's not an ideal place to live. And it's inappropriate. Those are some of the connotations of these spaces. And as a result, a majority of the void dwellers are struggling, and they want to come out of this space and go into now the space we call the Maid. So it's their biggest aspiration, it's their biggest dream, is to come out of that space and go into the Maid space. So this is the third category of the city as we see it. And this is a space that is affluent. It's the affluent areas of the city. These were the best places in the urban centers that were established, of course, by the colonialists. And in any town you go to today in Kenya, there's always, and I mean a town that was a a colonial administration center, there will always be a suburb called Milimani. Now, Milimani is a Swahili word for hills, the hills. So they settled in the hills where the weather was cooler, it was greener, and there's still a lot of those suburbs in those towns or cities that were colonial administration centers. Now, this Maid, the Maid is lush greenery. It's big mansions behind high perimeter walls, well-guarded homes with lush manicured gardens. There's a flurry of servants working in these homes, though they are now mostly occupied by the indigenous Kenyans, but obviously affluent indigenous Kenyans. The scent of colonial living is still very much entrenched, even in these people that live here, despite the fact that, you know, they were indigenous. And sometimes we get projects to do a project in a Maid space, and say, for instance, it's a residential house that we've been commissioned to do. One of the things that's always on the brief from the client is a space called a servant's quarter. Now, a servant's quarter was, it's a place, obviously, as the word itself says, a place where servants reside. It was a very colonial space. It was a space where, you know, if I was a colonial master in my big mansion, of course, I had all these people working for me who needed to stay with me, but not in my house. So a space was created for them to live in. But we still design such spaces even today. So we at CAVE explore and interrogate what these spaces actually mean in a post-colonial African city, and how can we change that narrative that is deeply entrenched within the soul of the city, or better still, maybe the lost soul of the African city. What does an African city look like without Western influence? What does an African city look like without colonial connotations attached to it today? And so we go back to the origin, and this is what the origin was. This is where it all began. Pre-colonial Africa did not have urban centers. It didn't have cities like we have them today. But there was designated trade areas or trade centers where different people from different tribes would meet maybe every once in a while and come and trade their goods. We had pastoralists who would come with their animals. We had people who were farmers, and they would come with their produce, and they would trade in these areas. So these were what maybe you would call the beginning of maybe an African urban center. And even today, we have, you know, market days in different places in Kenya today. If you go into different towns or different cities in Kenya, there's always a market day, and that's sort of a remnant of the origin, where, say, for example, a town has a market day on Tuesday. If you come on Monday, it's like a ghost town. On Tuesday, it's bustling with people trading, buying, selling, you know, really busy. And then you come on Wednesday, it's back to a ghost town and everybody has gone. So that is something that that used to happen then. So the origin is vast, open tracts of land with, and we realized that with so many people achieving their dream, moving from the void and getting into the Maid space, we've seen a lot of the people who are currently in the Maid moving out and going back to where it all began, going back to the origin. So we are exploring this return back to the origin through our research, and our research on caves. The caves being our origin in so many ways than not, because we see the cave as the original shelter for mankind. So what you see on your screen now is a project that we are doing in an origin space. So what we do when we get projects in our office, we categorize them and decide, is this a Maid space? Is it a Maid project? Is it an origin project? Is it a void project? And once we have, put it in its category, then we design for that category. So for instance, what you see here, it's a school for children who are, I don't want to use the word, I need to look for a word that's politically correct. So the one that's in my mind right now is not. But a lot of the children that here have mental disability, so Down syndrome or mental disability. So this is a school and a shelter for them, because a lot of people, what they do is they hide these children and lock them up as they go out to their day. So there's a lady that started a space for these children who can come have a place where they board and their parents can come see them and still get to learn, and they're taken care of in a special way. So this is a school in an origin space. And so, as I was saying earlier, we categorize it. We've categorized this as an origin space, and then we look back at what is the origin of this area, for example. What was the original architecture? What kind of material did they use? How did they construct? And then using the knowledge that we have gotten from school, from years of working, is integrate the two. So whatever was the origin and the technology we have today, different or new building materials we have today, mesh them together and still try and show it as our interpretation of modern African architecture. So not forgetting what was there, but also improving on what was there. So we use the same principle, whether it was a void project or whether it was a Maid project. I'm going to read the quote that you see now. The modern movement in architecture appeared to deny the primacy of language and representation as the core of the architectural paradigm, in preference for the new orthodoxy, for the international style. It was subsequently developed and projected around the world in the first half of the 20th century, at precisely the moment when the colonial machinery was at its most efficient, decimating the cultural means of resistance. These are words by Edward Ihejirika. Next slide.
As Stella said, the void is very problematic and a dysfunctional space. So is the origin and the Maid. They all exist as separate entities, and some of our work is to think about ways that the two can be thought of together and somehow bringing them back into an origin state and a state of harmony in many respects. We also explore a lot of photography in our work. This is a picture in one of the largest slums in Kibera of a lady with her child. The space in informal settlements can be quite profound and beautiful, but yet so mysterious and troubled. When you look at the materials of builds, where this is in the heart of the city, the sort of most expensive, one of the most expensive real estate, and yet we have a lot of origin materials from the sort of trees and branches that have been plugged in together with normal earthen blocks and a sort of earthen plastering, and a lot of stone, because stone is very much abundant in Kenya, and so the offcut stones are brought in to create a base. And so just reading these spaces for us afresh is quite important. While still considering the fact that there's so many challenges faced by the people. We've interacted with a few people in the space, as we call it, the void. The gentleman to the left, a very established man who just got lost in the void, speaks fluent English, extremely wise. At the time, I think he had a bit of alcohol. He was not all there, but when he spoke, it was like really special. And on the right, you have Wanjiko and her son behind, Ozzy. She's recycling fat, you can't quite see it, in one of the largest dump sites in Africa called Dandora dump site. And so there's a lot of difficult stories and challenges that are faced within these spaces. And part of our research is to look at Kibera, for example, and other informal settlements. And the image on the left is a plan and map, if you call it, of Kibera, capturing all the shacks and the mabati, which is like a corrugated steel structure, and earthen blocks and what have you. And the networks within them, a very beautiful grain, should you call it, of the settlement. And a lot of these spaces have unique moments, and the highlighted areas in red are sort of road confluences where roads meet together, where interesting things happen. And we've looked at some research that was done by Jonathan Scott, and he's looked at river confluences as spaces where lions love to wait around, and they're actually very special, unique spaces for them. And it's not to equate the animal with the human. That wasn't our purpose. It's to state the fact that upon confluences are quite interesting spaces. The image on the right is a collaborative project we're doing with Osborne Masharia, the image I showed you of the Mau Mau lady. And this project looks at trying to rethink space for the young millennials in the informal settlements, called Keja, which translates from Swahili to just like house or home, for the creative, the young creative in the informal settlements, and looking at materials from recycled corrugated steel to recycled GI pipes that are sort of decommissioned, and having a space where below he has or she has her home, and then above a sort of space and stage where they can showcase their work, their performances, or what have you, and a sort of inverted roof that collects rain and brings in light. This image is of Nairobi city in 1900. Right now, the city is really dense and heavily urbanized, but it began as a sort of origin space. As a result of the railway line, as it was called, the Lunatic Express, cutting through from the coast of East Africa towards Lake Victoria. And the British at the time wanted to secure the source of the Nile, which was problematic because in North Africa, in Egypt, the Suez Canal, that was a huge valued territory. And bizarrely, there seemed to be that project and need to protect the Nile. That's why they call it the Lunatic Express. They built a railway to protect a territory which was miles and miles away. So it's quite interesting to look at the city in its historic reference. This is a map of Nairobi city as really urbanized. And what we do, we try to analyze the city, and this being the Maid, as we'd call it, thinking about the origin. So we use the origin to look at the city in terms of a number of interesting things. The buildings highlighted in red highlight zones within the central business district where a lot of people come together, and either street preachers to politicians or wannabe politicians performers, and a sort of reliving of the oral African history still coming alive in the city that's in existence today, but that it's never really thought about as a key heart of the city. And so we look at these spaces as moments that are of serious significance in terms of our heritage, but that are completely disregarded right now as we speak. And the images here show these congregations, these spaces of congregation that are normally treated by city council as spaces that should not house these sort of activities, but they do because people want them. So and apologies for dotting back and forth between the origin and the void, but that's something we do as a way to dissect the spaces and bring them together and bring meaning to them. So we were commissioned to look at a project in Kenya that's about to take place. It's a museum of humanity, and based on the research from the Leakey family, and specifically Richard Leakey, who as a paleontologist has looked at and has been responsible for a lot of fossil finds within East Africa that date us back, as expressed in the beginning of this lecture, almost 1 million years ago. Now on Homo sapiens species, 250,000. And so a lot of these evidences are within Turkana, but the brief we were given was to think of graphical work to represent the spaces. And so we tried to challenge the brief in many respects, because the Turkana traditions suggest that the society had not just one monolithic origin, but rather what might be seen as a whole series of origins, highly dramatic, memorable, tales of Genesis, providing vivid idioms of socio-political identity, and also contain fundamental cosmological messages. But they also correspond to important stages of change in the development of the Turkana people. And such, they, together with less formal traditions associated with them, provide vital historical information. The factors which combined to enable the Turkana to carry out their vast and rapid territorial expansion as identified. And the Turkana are the people of the region. That territory is named Turkana as such. And Turkana, for those who might not know, is the destination and territory, or where it is argued by the Leakey family that we emerged out of Africa and moved towards the rest of the world. The origin story naturally is very contentious, where there have been many finds around the world that allow us to critique and question, really, where did we come from? So the question is really open, but we took this opportunity to look at a local perspective of origin and not negating the science. The reason why we bring these whales into the imagery, this is a beaked whale that was found in the desert in Turkana, speaking of a time when whales were sort of coming straight through from the East African coast down to the mainland and right into the Turkana territory, where the early man and woman species were. And so we create these sort of inverted landscapes to think and contemplate about a time when the Rift Valley was probably deluged with salt water. And so it's a sort of trying to connection of space and time when thinking about the origin. So after such a long introduction, and apologies for that, we now go into the Anthropocene Museum, a project and a fundamental basis of our research. And we combine, or should we say conjoin, the two words, the Anthropocene and the museum, for very good reason, which we'll hope to explain in a bit more detail. But the Anthropocene, as many of you might already know, states the fact that we are in a proposed geological age, which is the Anthropocene, an epoch in time where man and indeed woman have affected the systems on Earth to such a great extent that we are the dominant force. The epoch itself has not been formally ratified, but going by a sort of 400-page report by the United Nations, which was only just released towards the end of 2020, talking about this epoch in time, it presses upon us to contemplate that this is the time we are in. This slide predominantly just focuses on a NASA model that was generated to look at really the effects of greenhouse gases on the increase in temperature. And it's quite an interesting study. It's online, and they call it the model E2, created by NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, GISS. And within this model, they analyze the number of parameters and factors to contemplate, okay, and to query and question what is the cause of increasing temperature. And I think Trump should really look at this study. It's quite clear to show that the effects are clearly man-made, and that the evidence can no longer be denied. So in effect, for those who might not know, the International Chronostratigraphic chart, I always have difficulty pronouncing that long word, is a chart of the history of Earth in terms of epochs in time. And the proposed Anthropocene will be an insertion just after the Holocene period. So there's a lot of contentious discussions about that positioning of the epoch, if it should even be called the Anthropocene. And really it presents a lot of fundamental challenges and how would I put it, challenges directed in all professions, not least architecture, to contemplate what this time might mean within our practice, within our consciousness, within our projection into the future. And in a way, we try to think about that deeply. And for us, we sort of lay out this, this graph to think about what the epoch is saying, because the argument is that within the middle of the 20th century, and at that point, between the 1950s and onwards, it is believed that is at that point that the Anthropocene began. And equally, it is at that very moment when most anti-colonial movements took place. For obvious reason, the history of subjugation, or the history of civilization, as you'd call it, was catapulted forward through the subjugation and enslavement of people and exploitation of lands across the world. And so it's important to think about the colonial problem when you think of the Anthropocene, because it is at that very moment when the human pressures and human confrontations and exploitations were at their height and at their most critical and difficult moment. And hence we produce an overlay on factual maps about the increase in human population and that drive being at that very moment, as well as the increase in temperature, and overlaying the Mau Mau freedom fighter caves, of which the caves were used at that very moment. And right below it, you have the Trinity atomic bomb and the whole Manhattan Project to exert man's power against man. So it's quite a sort of difficult pill to swallow, but one that is about our existence. This is quite a beautiful image of the Trinity Test, the Manhattan Project. Quite troubling, but the very fact to represent that in any moment, in one click of the button, a nuclear war can be triggered and our existence completely compromised, not only ours, but that of non-human creatures. And this is just an image of a cave that was bombarded a few decades ago during the Mau Mau struggle. So with regards to the museum, and apologies that we are constantly, we're taking you through a very slow momentum and leading to the project, but you know, we call them museums, but really that's an euphemism. Personally, I love Zheng's documentaries. If you haven't seen them on Vice, they're fantastic. And she says that you might be better to call them warehouses of stolen loot. Like in 1897, the British forces entered the Kingdom of Benin, among other kingdoms in Africa, and which in this case was modern day Nigeria, and was violently looted, where hundreds of pieces of possessions, many are now in the Western museums and private collections. And so the museum, as well as an institution, is extremely troubled. Its history is laden with the immense exploitation and a sort of backdrop to the imperialist and colonial expansions across the entire world. And so we start to question what's the future of the museum? And I mean, we're not the only ones to question that. You know, and fundamentally thinking about what is a museum, yeah, and what does it mean for our people? And taking the example of Kenya and in Africa in general, the museum institution is borrowed again. It's not critiqued enough to question what does it mean for the people and that territory. And I think we choose to interrogate the two, the Anthropocene and the museum, and to look at what that could mean on a broader imaginary plane. And we also use Heidegger to think about it, where he states, we only begin to understand technology when we cease to notice it. And we could just as well as say that we only begin to understand architecture when we cease to notice it.
And we have an image here of where you don't see any architecture. So we only begin to understand architecture when we cease to notice it. Now, as architectural students, majority of you here are, I suppose, architectural students. When you look at this image, do you think of a project that you could design on this location? What do you think of? What thoughts run through your mind? Just look at that image and think what project you'd like to do there. Do you go to Arc Daily for inspiration? Do you go to Pinterest, Design? Maybe as you think of that project of yours for precedent studies? Or do you think about the origin? Who originally lived here? How did they construct their houses? How are their homesteads? How are the villages? And once you have this information, how do you then interpret it to respect every aspect of this site? You know, the things you mentioned to your tutors when you present your project: orientation, views, wind, direction, thermal mass, and so on. I'm sure those are the things you always, well, those are the things I started with when I was presenting my university projects. just to show that I had thought about those things, the sun, and some of the things that you think about, and as you think about what you have, what the project is, what the site conditions are, and then you go back to the history of this site and start to now formulate what that project could be. And that's where the phrase that Kabage read earlier comes in handy. You only begin to understand architecture when you cease to notice it, because you will need to have thought of so many other things before you put pen to paper and start to draw your beautiful sketches. There's so much thought process that needs to go through your mind. And if we go to the next slide.
Yeah, and touching on what Stella said, sometimes we also argue you can still imagine an architecture without a building, and we were really pushed towards the physical manifestations of architecture, but yet they are more poignant in the invisible in many times. And some of what we do in the Anthropocene Museum is to look at territories and question what's really happening, and look beyond any physical manifestations of the museum, but to question and use the museum as a critique of territories. And this image captures the similar territory as Stella highlighted, which is Suswa Mountain. And this is a neighboring area, territory called Olkaria, a Maasai territory, which unfortunately has been exploited quite heavily. Kenya, as some of you might not know, has actually already achieved 100% green energy production. We do not rely on any fossil fuels. We entirely rely on geothermal, hydropower, wind energy. And, we are so-called in the global south and a development nation, but we've actually achieved some goals that a lot of global north countries are really struggling to achieve. But with that state that we are in, geothermal energy, unfortunately, has a huge detriment in the environment. It's located within a rift valley, a lot of tectonic activity, a lot of geological activity, perfect location for dropping wells to exploit geothermal energy. But to do that, it's within a natural reserve and a territory where communities have resided for thousands of years. So currently what we have is detrimental impact, where even the World Bank has reported that a lot of malpractices with regarding the indigenous people have been recorded. And it's a report that's out there. And it's something that actually is going to, or we anticipate that's going to happen to also Mount Suswa, a very beautiful territory, as you saw before, that as well has a lot of geothermal activity. So part of the museum is to look at these locations, work with the community, and in terms of Suswa, work within the caves to discuss these matters. And our first curation that was showcased in New York, the Cooper Hewitt Museum, was a short film about our interaction and convening with the community to discuss these challenges. And in a way, we use the cave as that platform and that architectural space of heritage to resist the sort of heavy government focus to grow this geothermal energy, which is fantastic, but in disregard of the community's needs and the natural environment. So in many respects, we have a heritage of looking at the caves. And we refer to Plato's allegory of the cave. And the discussion we had in the cave, for us, we tried to relive and think about a reinterpretation of Plato's allegory. And if you'll excuse me, for those who might not know Plato's allegory of the cave, I'll just briefly read a short synopsis of it. So Plato's allegory states that there exist prisoners chained together in a cave. Behind the prisoners is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners are people carrying puppets or other objects. This casts a shadow on the other side of the wall. The prisoners watch these shadows, believing them to be real. Plato posed that one prisoner could become free. He finally sees the fire and realizes the shadows are fake and could escape from the cave and discover there's a whole new world outside that they are previously unaware of. This prisoner would believe the outside world is so much more real than that in the cave. He would try to return to free the other prisoners. Upon his return, he's blinded because his eyes are not accustomed to the actual sunlight within the cave. The chained prisoners would see this blindness and believe that they will be harmed if they try to leave the cave. So in many ways, Plato's philosophical use of the cave was about our emergence from the cave, the space of intellectual darkness that we need to emerge from. And obviously he looked at Socrates as a key reference and mentor, who was killed by the powers that be at the time. And for us, we returned back to the cave, albeit in a slightly different way, to think of our need to return back to that space, not ignoring and negating Plato's philosophical stance and approach to the cave, but to say it needs a rereading and a sort of stretching into what the cave means for humanity today. And this slide depicts the structure we created within the cave to stage the conversation between these players. In Plato's, there would be captives, but here, almost liberated peoples, where on the left, Beatrice Wanjiku, a former freedom fighter who, when she was young, during the time would feed her father, who was one of the Mau Mau freedom fighters. On the right, Sirma, a young boy who's part of the local Maasai group. On the bottom left, Ishmael, who is a conservationist, also part of the Maasai community, and one of the people who really brought to our attention the need and the challenges that geothermal activity have on the territory. On the right, an artist, Jackie Karuti, who we work with in terms of thought, and we have a number of meetings to discuss, and she was also part of the film. And so they completed the ensemble of the captives in the cave to have the discussion. And we brought in rocks, brought in bamboo to frame a structure which was proportioned based on our own anatomy, and some Fibonacci number sequences to frame a view into the deepest segment of the cave. So we have one of our strongest references that we keep referring back to, and it's from Leslie Loco's book, White Papers, Black Masks, which also is a tie back to Frantz Fanon, and her book, which is touching on architecture, race, and culture. And in one of the essays in the book, Araya Asgedom says, repetition as having beinness is the consideration of the past, not as a static event, not as a chronologically fixed date, which we can bring to our own age by mere visual or formal invocation, but of searching for the possibilities that would have been in the creative work of our ancestors. We find great inspiration from these words to think about, what were in the minds of our ancestors, and how caves played a significant part within that framing. This is an image that connects the Suzuka Mountain network of caves to the Mbai network of caves, which were the territories where the Mau Mau resides, and indeed through the entire network. And we stage here a sort of event of resistance that it's still in the planning, and part of which will feature in Venice. We conduct, as we call it, a reverse architecture to think backwards, and using caves and the laser scanning technology of an existing living structure and living heritage architecturally, and slice it back in time to think about what these proportions were, what was these spaces and caverns like, the humidity, the sort of beyond parametric expression of the geology, and only technology of that caliber within this perfect time could unearth that. And this is one cross section and planning sequence of the Mbai cave. And we produce models, bronze models, as artifacts in their own right, that sat in the Smithsonian Museum, being the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, which was on display there. And we create them while thinking of the geology. With this regard, it's a bronze model created in fire, and we 3D printed the 3D scan in plastic and used that plastic as a mold for the bronze cast. And it is a 1:100 almost replica of the cave as it is, and for us remains as a key artifact that we take around, and we'll hopefully take it to Venice as well as part of our exhibition.
So this is us back in a cave, and back in Kwale County. The first image you saw at the beginning of the lecture was the Shimoni slave caves. Now these are another set of caves. They are called the Three Giant Sister Caves. So when we went to Shimoni in January, we didn't know about these other caves. We actually got to learn about them while we were at Shimoni. And being spelunkers, there's no way we were going to come back to Nairobi without having a look at these other caves, the Three Giant Sister Caves. And yeah, so we went there, and we actually found out that the Shimoni slave caves and these Three Giant Sister Caves are actually connected through a series of tunnels that are about 4 kilometers. 4 kilometers. And what used to happen with the people that were held captive in the caves as they waited for the ships to take them to the slave market in Zanzibar, some of them would be lucky to escape. And they escaped through this series of tunnels. And at the end of those tunnels, they found refuge in the Three Giant Sister Caves. And currently these tunnels have, they are blocked, obviously, from silt that has accumulated over years and years, centuries. And so that has accumulated and blocked the passages. But one of the things we hope to do as part of our research, and as we continue to find out the connection and study these caves, is hopefully unearth those tunnels and possibly find deeper meaning. So a lot of you know about the transatlantic slave trade, which is very well documented, and a lot is known about it, but very little is known about the East African slave trade, which happened, and not so much is documented about it. And so through that, we hope to uncover a lot more that's not yet known and make it known to people. So once we are able to, unearth this vast network of tunnels, collect information, yeah, and we see what that reveals. So it's something we are quite excited to pursue. We haven't quite thought about it, how we'll go about it, get permits and get permission from the government to even start doing such a a big task. But hopefully at some point we'll be able to go through that. Now, the experience at the Three Giant Sister Caves, oh my goodness, you need to come to Kenya and come to the Three Giant Sister Caves to experience it for yourselves. We went to these caves and yeah, it was quite an experience. I'll try and describe it a bit, and hopefully you'll be booking your flights to Kwale soon to experience the same thing. So we went into these caves, and the guides that were there told us they are resident to millions, and I am not even exaggerating, millions of bats. And these bats obviously hide in the dark because they're nocturnal and come out in the night. And so what these guides make you do is you crawl through these little tunnels and then crawling, and then they open up into a huge opening in the middle. And all this time the guides tell you don't put on your lights, and once you get there then they say put on your lights, and you see all these little eyes looking at you, and because now and then they tell you now put on your your lights, and obviously the bats want to come out because you brought light into there, and here you are with millions of bats trying to crawl out of this narrow space. It's quite something. And you'd think as I describe it, I experienced it. I didn't, because I'm a mother and I needed to come back to Nairobi safely. So I did not go into the chamber with the bats, but Kabaga did, and hopefully I've described it properly, Kabaga. But you have bats here on your face and on your sides because you're all trying to come out of this tunnel. But yeah, so even in as much as Kabaga has gone through all this more technical stuff, we do have fun as we explore these caves and research about them. So the Shimoni caves they are coral, and over time obviously they have come up and were used as caves of refuge, as caves of slavery. But we hope to see, as we research back on the origin, what is it? Where do we come from? What did people sacrifice for us to be able to freely go into a cave that was once a prison for some people?
So just to end, this is just a few snippets of certain modes of inquiry. We do a lot of writing, and where Stella and I collaborate on doing essays. Our recent be out on the Architectural Review. We have the journal Modern African Architectures by Leslie Loco. I wrote a piece on it, which looked at a sort of relook at Plato's allegory of the cave in a bit more detail. And as highlighted, the Venice Biennale, we're frantically trying to get it all together and finished in an incredibly difficult pandemic period and a short time scale. And yeah, we had the pleasure to be part of the World Around, run by Beatrice Galilee. It was fantastic. And yeah, so we thank you for this opportunity you gave us to give you a snippet of our work. Over to you. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Kabaji and Stella. That was great. That was great. I mean, for me, it was a first time listening. I listened to your Guggenheim talk to, but journey into African continent, what's happening there and what you're thinking and why. And thanks for that overview and also why you're thinking that way and your sort of snippets of your work. I think that was a nice journey, intense, and it's a nice journey. So thank you for that delivery. That's great. Now we have some time to take some comments or so observation comments or questions from the audience. If you want to, just type it on the chat, or you can sort of turn on your camera and ask yourself directly as well. I have a starting question, I guess. You know, there's such a kind of interesting overlay of your journey of cave and the history and the kind of the when I saw your computer nerve model and your bronze model, it's beautiful sort of artifact, but it also resonates the kind of history, right? And geography and a history, the kind of dark history. I think it's kind of this sort of kind of a interesting dialectic between the beauty of the object, beauty of the space, with the kind of a historical weight and the question of the quest of the origin. Is that going to be some? Do you think? I know you're sort of constantly thinking through this, but is that going to be somewhat of a kind of a condition that you will always sort of couple with in terms of your practice, the kind of formal beauty and the kind of the weight of the thinking? Yeah, I'm just wondering about that.
That's a really interesting question. Never really been asked it. To talk about the beauty in the midst of interpretation of such a difficult past. And in many ways, we try to do that intentionally because the role we feel as architects and artists in many ways is to look at the beauty throughout the process of analysis, through research, through a sort of divergence of all these moments of history and interpret it in a beautiful way and present it in a beautiful way. Because at the end of the day as well, we question the way we've been represented over time from colonial and imperialist history. And a beauty has a big part to play with how we look at dark history in a really light and profound way, but that something that is as a matter of fact that can be taken and looked at as a beautiful piece. So for that, it's actually very important to look at the sort of dichotomy of the two things and bring them together through a strong narrative, an architectural narrative, which we read through drawings and model making and space analysis. Yeah.
At the very end of your presentation, is the cave going to be at the kind of the formal sort of spatial condition for the Anthropocene Museum sort of undertaking? Is that how this is going forward, or I'm just curious about that part?
So in many respects, we feel the Anthropocene Museum exists through the events and the forums within the cave, but not confined to the cave. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of any institution, that it's fixed within the four walls and limited in how it can question and challenge the status quo. And so we feel without a sort of heavy bureaucratic institutional baggage, it has a space of its own, that it's not confined to a space, but that deals with issues, that it's performative, but yet critical, and yet a sort of beautiful exercise, all wrapped in one. So we call our events curations, exhibition curations, and within the landscape that sometimes are in the cave, sometimes are out, but usually in the caves. Yeah. Sorry if I'm not answering your question. You could.
No. I'm really enjoying the kind of layers of thinkings that you have, and then I suspect that this is coming from the context you're in, with the question of origin, reference to the history, to the conditions of the geography. I think, and then all new developments and so all these. I think these complexity of these layers of issues are quite heavily sort of influencing all the things that you're doing, which I sense, and then I think that's very much so evident in your way of describing your work. Now we have a question from the audience. Elina, do you want to ask the question yourself? Maybe turn the camera on.
Hi, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. I am from Montana and I am really interested in social geography and how it relates to architecture. I'm wondering if your firm and through the process of your research, do you include the public in that journey?
Maybe I can answer that. Yes, we do. And we see ourselves, our role as conveners, and we convene different stakeholders from the community, government, you name it, and hold conversations with these people, usually, as Kabage has said, usually in the cave, and discuss issues that affect them. Like when we were in Suswa, we spoke about the effects of geothermal on the community and what can the community do, what can government do to address those issues. At Shimoni, we spoke with some community elders and spoke a lot about slavery, because one of the issues we realized is this, like for instance in Shimoni, two camps. One that believes slavery took place, and believe it or not, another that believes that it did not take place, despite the fact that you still see the chains on the walls of the cave. But yes, we do sit with these people, communities, and discuss with them at their local level, and then try and see how then we can address those issues with the right people to help the community. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll try to take one more question from the audience before. I know it's the evening. What time is it there? Like 9:30?
Yeah, it's about 9:30 p.m.
Don't let me be the only inquisitor here. I have lots of questions, but that's okay. Do you intend to draw these sort of social geography layer in your exhibition in Venice? I'm just curious, leading from the question. Thanks for the question, actually.
Yeah, without divulging too much, yes, Stella and I both argue that the museum is a sort of moving museum. So a part of that curation is going to go into Venice to enact a few things there. We call it transposing. We hope to transpose part of the cave over there and convene with the curators. Yeah.
So your installation will enact something in Venice. Is that what you're saying?
That's the intention, but depending on the sort of COVID
right, of course,
protocols that we put out, we're not sure if it'll happen.
So thank you. I think I'm just going to read off a couple of comments on the board, and maybe we'll wrap the discussion there. Beautiful work. Thank you. Just wanted to say thank you very much for the presentation. It was truly inspiring and enlightening. Well, thank you, Kabaji and Stella, joining us from across the whole globe in a way. And I'm more enticed to visit. I know we have lots of African origin students in our faculty right now, currently, and I have more things to talk about with them now. Now I have a little bit of an overview of your presentation, and I look forward to your Venice installation, however it can be turned out to be in this condition. But we look forward to encountering your work in near future, more intense sort of development of what you're set out yourself with right now. I think a lot of opportunities that we can sort of look forward to in the future to see your work. Thanks for your contribution to our imagination right now, and actually very thoughtful account of the notion of origin, because we do also have that the territorial condition and the origin condition, recent past, recognizing, recognizing now, kind of historical condition as well. So it sort of gives us an opportunity to think about our origin and our history as well. So thank you for that opportunity to think about that, reflect on it. Thanks again.
Thank
We'll wrap.
you. Thank you for
Thank you.
having us.